Welcome to Bruce Hurwitz Presents Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Bruce Hurwitz of Hurwitz Strategic Staffing. You can find us on the web at hsstaffing.com. I hope you consider us for all your staffing, career counseling, and professional writing needs. I am delighted to be joined today by Heather Claus. We will be discussing boundaries and their impact on our lives. Meet the Experts is sponsored by P&K CPAs. P&K is a full-service accounting firm. They provide accounting and consulting services to businesses ranging from startups to small and mid-cap companies to nonprofits, as well as high-net-worth individuals. Contact them today for a free consultation at info@pk-cpas.com or call them at 973-882-8810. They will be happy to be of service. Heather, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Take a moment or two and introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hi, I'm Heather. My pronouns are she, hers. I have lived an atypical life. I have hitchhiked across the country. I have joined the carnival. I have walked barefoot around New York City with street people. I have studied and educated on alternative lifestyles and so many more things. And in all of my experience and in all of my journeys, the one thing that I have come to believe is that boundaries are the key to not only saving ourselves, but our relationships. So that's why I'm here to talk with you today.
And I thank you. When I saw the topic, I had to laugh because I don't know if you're acquainted with it, but there's a test that they sometimes give to see what an individual would be good at.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the DISC evaluation.
Yeah, familiar.
Every time I've taken it, I knew it was a waste of time. And it always comes back to saying, says I'm a rule follower, and I explain, yes, I'm a rule follower, but the reason that I'm a rule follower is because I'm a good decision maker. So if you put me with somebody who's just a rule follower, that'll be fine up to a point. But when it comes to decision making, we will not get along, and it never works. So I am a big believer in setting boundaries.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
that's a perfect example.
There's a problem. You said boundaries for yourself. That's all fine and good. How do you set boundaries for someone else?
You don't, actually. So the way I explain boundaries is boundaries are an expression of our personal power. And where we end and others begin that's a boundary. Right. So boundaries essentially encompass everything that we want and want more of and are willing and able to take responsibility for and control. Right. Everything outside of that is other people, their actions, their behaviors, the things they have to take responsibility for and control. So when it comes to like setting boundaries for yourself, you can say, as you just did, I don't generally mesh well when it comes to decision making with people who simply follow rules versus being thoughtful decision makers, right? So that's your boundary. When those people attempt to interact with you or sway your decisions, you cannot necessarily stop them if they're absolutely determined to try to do these things. But what you can do with your boundaries is say, okay, I'm willing to hear this person out until such a time as, we've wasted too much time, or things are going in circular patterns, nothing's getting done, or they are starting to raise their voice, or they are trying to invalidate my experience or my thought processes. And that's when you can say, when this happens, I will politely and respectfully end the conversation and step away. so that it doesn't escalate and so that I don't have to put up with their idiocy.
Speaking of idiocy, you remind me of a couple who were having, you mentioned walking barefoot in New York City, something that I would not recommend these days.
No, I wouldn't recommend it those days either. This was a very different,
That's all right.
wild youth of time.
That's all right. There were two idiots in a fight, and there were two police officers who separated them, calmed them down, talked to them, and one of the officers walked over to me, probably just to gather himself and to take a deep breath. And I looked at him and I said, "Why didn't you just shoot the two of them?" And he said to me, "Too much paperwork," which I thought was a perfect answer because it just got the humor, released the tension.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, today, I don't know that that would fly, but back then it was okay. There are some things that are clear.
Mhm.
The law sets boundaries,
Yes.
all right? I once read a book, it was a very interesting concept, said the law doesn't prohibit you from doing things. It just tells you what price you'll pay for doing it.
Yes.
So you kill someone, you're going to die. You're going to be executed. You rob a bank, you'll go to jail for 10 years. If you're willing to pay the price, do the crime. All right?
Mhm.
Simple. We're now using computers. The computers were set up by people who had boundaries, and they created things for us to do, but we gotta have to do it their way. On Zoom, I can't all of a sudden, at least to the best of my knowledge, move you from this side of the screen to this side of the screen.
Mhm.
Right? I can't move the camera to see what's going on your left. If there's an animal, a pet, on the sofa next to you, I can't do that. The system is set up the way it is set up. There are people who cannot work within the system. They have difficulties on the computer. They have fewer difficulties in the real world, if you will, because they know the law says you can't do this, so they don't do it. They're not criminals. But they would like to be able to change things in the functioning of their tools, but you can't do it because the tool is built a certain way. How do you advise people who are having difficulty with boundaries to get over it, to accept the boundaries and use them to achieve their goals?
Well, so the first thing I would say is that, when it comes to the law and it comes to software as examples, I don't even necessarily think of the law as boundaries. I think of it as rules, because the law is not controlling itself. It is attempting to place consequences on others. Whereas software, I think of that more as technical limitations, right? You can't do this because we haven't built it. Either we haven't built it because we think it's morally wrong, in which case that would be their personal boundaries or their corporate boundaries, or they haven't built it because it doesn't match their market, or they haven't gotten around to it or whatever. But when it comes to people, like you and I interacting, and you set a boundary and I don't particularly like it, my choices are honor it and still look for a way to engage with you, right?
Huh?
Or
Bye-bye.
try to push past it, try to convince you that, there's something there that, maybe this boundary isn't as valid as you thought it was. Or as you said, leave. Yeah, 100%.
Well, I have one boundary on this show that I can think of, and that's no profanity.
Sure.
And it was very funny. I could tell the person was seated at his desk, just like I am, and he moved, and then he started to curse. And I knew exactly why. He had hit his knee up against the leg of the desk. And if you've ever done that, cursing is acceptable. All right. Now, I didn't know how to edit. I still don't. But I had to stop the recording. And he apologized, and then we started over again. But that's the rule.
Yeah.
All right. Simple enough. And if you don't like it, I don't want you on my show. Exactly. Now, you said rules versus boundaries. Maybe I should have asked, maybe the first question I should have asked you is, what's a boundary?
So the boundary is that dividing line between what is me, what I am willing to take responsibility for, what I want to protect and prioritize, and what is everyone else, what I want less of in my life, what I don't want in my life, what you as a human, as a Bruce, are responsible for, that is you, that's not me, right? So inside, as the saying goes, inside the boundaries, these are my monkeys, this is my circus. Outside the boundaries, those are not my monkeys, not my circus, right? Versus, we were talking about rules. Rules are guidelines for behavior for multiple people and or groups, generally speaking. They're guidelines set from an external source. So for example, like to me, a law is very much a rule. This is an external source saying you cannot, right? Cannot do this. That is wrong. That is bad. Yada, 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 yada. Your parents telling you, you have to clean your plate in order to get dessert. That is a rule. That is not a boundary. That is not somebody saying, this is how I affect myself and take responsibility and prioritize the things that are important to me. This is, I am doing it for you because it's for your own good, or because it's for the good of society, or, the good of our corporation, or the good of profits, or whatever it is, right? So there's the external versus internal factors. Boundaries are about us, our control over our experience in life. And what I like to say is, the only thing we can control is ourselves, and we do that imperfectly. But that's what boundaries are. Everything else is what is put upon us by others or society or whatever.
Two things. How do we learn what our boundaries are?
So I have an exercise that I have people go through. And since since I'm talking with you, rather than doing it from a purely personal perspective, I'm going to do it from the work relationship perspective, right? So looking at your current employment, if you have it, and past employment. Look at, okay, what were the things about these jobs or contracts or whatever that filled you up? That's one side of the piece of paper. So even looking back, even if you parted ways with that employer in a not so positive fashion or whatever, what did you love about that work that filled you up? On the other side of the piece of paper, what were the things about your current or previous employments that drained you? What are the things that, like, no matter how hard you tried, it just sucked the life out of you? Generally speaking, I mean, and I'm not talking about like, well, I had to work, right? Because, that's something that is going to happen everywhere. You have to do work. But toxic work environment, right? That could be one of those things where somebody kept stealing my ideas. That is something that totally drains you, because no matter how hard you work to get ahead, if somebody else is taking credit for all that work, that's incredibly draining and soul sucking. So that would be how to determine your boundaries. The parts of your employment, for example, that drain you, that just leave you feeling overwhelmed and hopeless and whatever. And that's where you're going to be touching on, there's a boundary here that I need to start setting. Maybe it's 16-hour days, right? That's valid. I will not work a 16-hour day. That's a valid boundary. I mean, unless you're in medical. And in some cases in medical, you're going to work a 16-hour day or 12 to 16-hour day, 3 or 4 times a week. And then you're not, so again, knowing what is going to work for you and what is not is often a function of actually examining your life that you currently have and knowing what is working for you and what is not.
You said, I just have to comment on it, when people take credit for your work happened to me a lot.
Yeah, that's an intellectual boundary.
Happened. I was so incensed I couldn't say a word. And when I was leaving, it was my direct supervisor who did it. And when I was leaving, her boss stood behind me, put his arm around me and said, "Isn't it aggravating when people take credit for your work?" So he knew. I learned a lot from that man. And one of the things that I learned is that when people take credit for your work, it almost always comes back to bite them because they can't explain it because they didn't do it. I had a boss who took credit. He didn't say it was his idea. He presented it as though it was his idea. And when they started asking him questions and he couldn't answer them, and this was a board meeting, one of the board members said, "Well, let's ask Bruce to explain it." So he never do that again. But that's a side issue. You said you can only control yourself. But you can set boundaries for other people.
You can set boundaries for how you accept other people's behavior, but you can't set boundaries for them, right? Because you can say, you can't talk to me like that, but obviously they can. They're talking to you like that, right? So you can't set that boundary for them. You can simply say, if, this continues to happen, I'm going to step away from the conversation. And we can continue it via email because obviously, tempers are rising and this isn't going to work to, get us to where we need to get. That's setting a boundary by saying, this is me and what I can control in this situation. I can't tell you to calm down. I mean, I could, but how many times is that? Calm down. Oh yeah, that really works for me, right? I can't control how you are going to react or behave in a situation, but when you start doing something that it crosses one of my boundaries, I can control how I behave and react, and I can remove or reduce that harm by removing or reducing my engagement.
Every personnel handbook establishes boundaries.
Rules.
Call them whatever you want.
Yeah.
You are not permitted to do this.
Yes.
If A happens and you don't like it, then this is how we're going to handle it. These are our processes. These are our procedures. I call them boundaries. You call them rules. It makes no difference.
I think it does make a difference though, Bruce, because boundaries are something that are internally motivated, whereas rules are things that come to us from the external.
Okay.
So like, for example, dress code. If I were dressing my authentic self, I would wear X, Y, and Z. If I were going to work in a particular corporation, I would have to wear what they require of me. And
you said something which begs the question. Where are you located right now?
Raleigh, North Carolina.
Where are you from?
Iowa.
Why did you say X, Y, or Z instead of Z?
During my many, many years of travels, I have picked up colloquialisms from all over the place, like in various travels. And I just like, I would pick up fun little words and curious ideas and thoughts from, wherever I happened to be, especially as a younger child. And I would bring them back with me, and they have become an amalgam of, how I speak.
I grew up in Canada. That's why I asked the question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it's entirely possible that I either picked it up during some travels in Canada or when we were over in Europe.
Because Europeans speak English.
Yes.
We still have some time. You had said, I'm just curious about it.
Mhm,
You
yep.
had said you had worked in a carnival.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So,
And how that informs your position on boundaries.
sure. I was much, much younger. I actually turned 16 traveling with the carnival. And I joined the carnival seeking adventure. I thought that, it was going to be traveling and fun and parties every night. And what I ended up with was 22 older brothers who were very protective. And I don't think I learned so much about boundaries in the carnival itself as I got into young adulthood, and I looked back on where my wayward, radically individual personality, took me just on whim. I looked back and I experienced more than one moment of retroactive fright for the dangers that I put myself in that thankfully were never realized, right? Like I was 15 years
cannonball.
Yeah. Yeah. I was 15 years old alone joining a carnival. Right? Like there's a lot of damage that could have been done to me.
Sure. Was this in Europe?
No, this was actually in the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Pennsylvania area.
The stories I've heard about, I believe the affectionate term is carnies.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was derogatory. That's why I said affectionate, just to be on the safe side.
Sure.
Is some fun and a lot of hard work.
Yes. And very in-group, out-group. There are a lot, like just like anything else, you watch TV and you see mob shows, right? Or criminal shows or whatever. They have their own code of honor that is very in-group, and it only applies to the in-group. Mm-hmm. And everybody else, those are the townies. They don't count. They don't get the same treatment. They are not one of us. Right? It's a very different perspective. And looking back, I can see that some of the things I picked up and learned from them and their treatment of townies and how I was different because I was theirs versus the women that they met in each town and treated in their very misogynistic. And when I say misogynistic, I don't mean like they weren't intentionally misogynistic. It was just, this was part of the culture. It was still just as bad, but they weren't intending to be bad. They just were, right, in that particular regard. They were very good
still your 22 protective brothers.
Yes, yeah. And being able to visually and emotionally experience the difference between how they treated me and cherished me and protected me, and how they treated other girls exactly like me, but that weren't part of the group. Mm-hmm. Informed a lot of, my thought processes and curiosities as I, went into young adulthood and then into, as I grew older.
I wasn't expecting that to be the segue. That's a great segue to my penultimate question. How do you allow someone into your boundaries?
So the way I look at it is,
Well, a townie becoming a carny.
right. So the way I look at it is not that I allow them into my boundaries. My boundaries are my boundaries. However, the way that I have my boundaries set up is what is acceptable for a person that is, let's say 7 steps removed from me versus somebody who is very intimate to me. They have different boundaries apply. Like, I don't let them inside my boundaries so much as this boundary does not apply to somebody I know deeply and well and trust, whereas it would apply to somebody who is more of a stranger. So I don't think of it as letting them in, more like knowing ahead of time how people earn that ability to truly connect with me past some of the, layers. Not unlike, let's look at it this way. Physical boundaries, how much space you allow around yourself. When you are with somebody that you're intimate with, it's not so much that they're in your boundary, it's that the boundary with them is much smaller. Whereas the boundary with a menacing stranger on a dark night in New York City, that boundary is going to be much, much bigger. So I think of it as a flexible or situational type of thing. And that is, as I get to know somebody over time, I look for consistencies of behavior that align with my values.
So, and this is an additional question, not one I was planning. Is a boundary a wall, figuratively speaking?
In some ways it can be. For some, it definitely is. Like, so if you were to say, we have in the alternative lifestyles, we have a topic called hard limits, right? So you've got soft limits. These are things that you can flex on. I don't think I'm interested in that, but in the right situation, I'd be willing to try it, right? A hard limit might be something like, oh, no. Well, let's go back to the TV shows, right? I was just watching The Equalizer 2, no? Mentalist. I was just watching The Mentalist, and somebody tried to send a contract killer to kill a child. And the contract killer said, I don't do kids. And got up and left the car and left the guy all by himself to figure it all out. That is a hard limit, right? He didn't say, I don't do kids unless you pay me an extra $1 million. Mm-hmm. That would be a soft boundary, right? Yeah. This was, I don't do kids. I never shoot kids. That the contract is over and done with, right? Like, done.
Now I've come to our final question. And as I'm asking it, I'm going to put up your contact information. And I will let us appear once more. Heather, is there anything that I did not ask you that you wish I had asked you? And if I had asked you, what would you have said?
Yeah, there's one thing that I always like to, kind of make clear. It's a chapter in my book, which is called Take No SH asterisk T. But the chapter in my book is, it's not your fault, right? Us humans are generally not raised or socialized to have good boundaries. So wherever you are, it's not your fault if you're looking at yourself and saying, ooh, gosh, I have really craptaculous boundaries. It is, however, our responsibility to learn to do better for ourselves, to improve our lives, to protect our hearts and our minds and our time, how we prioritize time and the things that are important to us.
Heather, thank you very much for coming on. This has been very interesting. I appreciate it, and I'm sure our viewers do as well.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
I'm Bruce Hurwitz. Thank you for watching. And as always, please stay focused on success.